Bonjour tout le monde, and welcome to my most ambitious podcast project yet, which will not only promise to be my longest to date, but also features pictures. I finally feel like I belong on YouTube now. But really though, this one was something of a labor of love, and something I wanted to get out there before the end of Pride once I started experimenting with audio content. Over on my blog, I'm well known for talking about queer subtext in media just about any chance I get, but here I get to reach a potential new audience and also explore the subtext in a game series that's rife with it, despite the fact that I don't feel like it's discussed in the broader fandom all that often. I am, obviously, talking about Fire Emblem, and today I wanted to take a look at some of the numerous examples of subtextual same-sex attraction that have popped up in this franchise's 30-plus year history. I get the impression that a lot of fans who first got into the series through Awakening or Fates or even Three Houses look at the Avatar same-sex S-ranks in those latter two games and think that that's the extent of what Fire Emblem has to offer in terms of queer content. And if I accomplish nothing else in this podcast, I hope to clear up that misconception. A big part of that, admittedly, comes from a kind of irate, back-in-my-day place on my part, because I am old enough to remember a time not so very long ago when explicit, or canon, if you will, queer content in media was very much the exception rather than the rule. And for people like myself who enjoy that kind of content, that creates the expectation that we'd have to dig deep into lightly suggestive scraps of canon information, if not just invent it ourselves in fandom spaces. While that approach to media can still be useful today, I mean, just look at how long this video is, I feel like it's not appreciated nearly as much, which I personally consider a shame. Transformative fandom has the potential to inspire all sorts of wonderful fan work and community, and it's traditionally done so outside the often rigid boundaries of canon. In Fire Emblem terms specifically, there's a much bigger picture here than a handful of S-ranks in 2 games. And I guess Heather from Radiant Dawn and Leon from Echoes, because basically everyone agrees that those two are canonically gay. That's right, guys. In a game franchise with something like 700 playable characters, 2 of them are definitively and exclusively same-sex attracted, plus about a dozen bisexuals based solely on the aforementioned Avatar S-ranks. This is why it's important to talk about subtext. Alright, a couple of disclaimers before we get into this, though. I welcome your comments, but please keep these in mind when doing so. Number 1, this list is not comprehensive. It's based on subtext that I've either observed myself or observed others discussing in my many years within the online FE community. I have my own preferences and biases like anyone else, and the subtext I choose to highlight here will naturally reflect those. Most obviously, it's always more difficult for me to pick up on substantial homoerotic subtext between women because I am not a woman, queer or otherwise. There will certainly be examples of Fire Emblem's lesbian subtext in this video. However, it's not my specialty, and it's harder for me to discuss it with any kind of personal investment. I have also decided not to talk about any trans content here, not because I don't think there is any in Fire Emblem or that I don't think it's worth talking about, but because I'm less familiar with most aspects of trans identity, and because honestly I think that subject could warrant its own video. Do let me know if you're interested in me covering that topic more in depth in the future. Number 2. Most examples are not hard canon. Let me repeat that. Most of these examples are not canon. For fans who, to put it politely, do not enjoy these kinds of analyses of their favorite media, the knee-jerk rebuttal when it comes to subtext is that it's not official or canon, as if this were something fans who do enjoy queer content in media were not already aware of. The very concept of subtext thrives in that kind of plausible deniability that allows content creators to tease more risque or controversial material while simultaneously claiming that they never technically intended to mean anything by it so as not to risk alienating a portion of their audience. I'm fully aware that 90% or more of the content of this video could be no homo down to bromances or just gals being pals or whatever. So I'm putting this big old asterisk near the start to say both that I'm aware of that and that I don't care. And I assure you that anyone who engages in these kinds of discussions online, even if it's purely for light entertainment purposes, doesn't care either. That's the beauty of transformative fandom, the ability to work outside the boundaries of established canon. Number 3. Canon subtext is preferred to fanon. This one may sound a little contradictory following what I just said, but allow me to clarify. For those who may not know, fanon is a term describing something that has been widely accepted in the fandom for a particular piece of fiction, despite the fact that it has no solid basis in canon. Basically, it's a headcanon that gets extra popular. To use a non-sexual FE example, Hubert from Fire Emblem Three Houses is often depicted in fanwork as having discolored or scarred hands from his work with either dark magic or poisonous chemicals. There's zero canon evidence suggesting that that's true, but it was an intriguing idea that caught on among fan artists and writers. Fanon pairings can work in a similar fashion, with people shipping characters who may not have had much interaction or chemistry in canon, but who are of great enough interest to fans that they're willing to disregard that lack of foundation and build it themselves. There's a particular Three Houses character who has an abundance of fan and gay content, and while I won't be talking about him today, you may find him conspicuous by his absence. I absolutely don't have a problem with Fanon shipping. Hell, pretty much my favorite pairing from the Jugdral games is pure Fanon. But I do think there's a line to be drawn between shipping with some kind of canon basis, faint as it may be, and shipping that rests purely on wishful thinking and possibly the contributions of some influential members of the fandom. We're sticking to the first category in this video, because the second one is just too vast to be taken in all at once. And finally, number 4. Examples are not always positive. I've talked a bit before about how Fire Emblem loves its off-color sexual content, with same-sex relationships as just one part of a much larger picture that also includes such hellacious subjects as camp-follower dancers, half-naked dragon girls who are legal purely on a technicality, and the ever-popular brother-sister incest subtext. As such, I'm shying away from the term queer representation in this video, as in a broader context that doesn't strike me as a concern of the developers, so much as they're concerned about catering to a wide range of interests in a predominantly amoral way. In older, pre-Avatar games, the less flattering instances of queer subtext were largely forgotten about by the fandom, although God knows I haven't forgotten about them in this video or in general. But nowadays, the player's self-insert can sleep with their adoptive siblings, or their students, or a woman who's magically like their mother, grandmother, and daughter all at the same time. So I'm not inclined to perceive Corrin and Byleth getting a handful of same-sex S-ranks as a victory for the gays or anything like that. No judgment if you're into any of that other stuff, by the way, but keep in mind that I'm discussing subtext in as morally neutral terms as possible here. But with all the qualifying asterisks out of the way, let's get started with Archanea and Jugdral. Collectively referred to as the Kaga era after the series' creator, these games don't have a lot to offer in terms of subtext, in large part due to the technical limitations of their consoles and the lack of support conversations to flesh out characters in interesting ways. Note, too, that I'm also including the DS remakes of Mart's games in here, because honestly they don't contribute all that much to this conversation either. As you may expect from a header that lumps together 7 of the 16 mainline games, we really have to dig deep for some of these. That's not to say that the Kaga games lack for suggestive sexual content, however. Shadow Dragon breaks the mold of its era by not suggesting an attraction between the protagonist and the NPC princess he rescues, a la Mario or Link, and Mart's games overall are strangely defined to an extent by the complicated romantic entanglements of Camus, aka the man who already had a pair of alts 2 decades before he was added to Heroes. And when it comes to Jugdral, everyone knows that setting has enough canon incest to put it up there with Game of Thrones, plus it opens with the threat of forced marriage and implied rape. Again, not too far off from Game of Thrones there. There are glimpses of what's to come later here and there, though. When Julian recruits Ricard in Mystery of the Emblem, Ricard makes it sound like they had a casual fling or a one-night stand at some point, which Julian is clearly embarrassed about. But then New Mystery sort of no-homos that, maybe? I only mention these two to point out that thieves are going to be showing up in this video a lot, possibly more than any other class archetype. Speaking of New Mystery, while it doesn't push the dating sim aspect of its avatar anywhere near as heavily as those who would follow, you can maybe pull a bit of romantic subtext out of the avatar's relationship with Katarina, regardless of Chris's gender. This is going to be a recurring issue with these self-inserts, because the use of similar, if not identical, scripts for both male and female avatars can create the perception that certain characters are into them either way. For example, Crom with male Robin, Azura with female Corrin, or Dimitri with male Byleth. Given my general distaste for avatars and the odd things they can do to a game's writing, I'm loath to really count those as legitimate subtext, but technically they do exist. Moving on to Jugdral, though, there's Marty from Thracia, who carries the colorful epithet of the man whom Dagdar loved. Now, Dagdar and Marty never speak as far as I can recall, and Dagdar has a daughter and seems to be a little bashful about Abel at one point, but those aren't what I call conclusive evidence that these two aren't a Baron Cub couple co-parenting Tanya. Make it happen in a remake, Intelligent Systems. Would love to see it. But I've saved the best here for last, an instance of one man's deep-lasting devotion to another man being so strong that the entirety of Thracia 776 and about 1/3 of Genealogy's second generation would never have happened without it. I'm speaking of Finn, the most loyal and favored knight in service of Quan, Prince of Leinster and dedicated Thracian imperialist. Yes, really. Finn enters Sigurd's war at Quan's side, and although Quan dies in the events leading up to the end of the First Generation, Finn survives the fall of Leinster Castle with Quan's son Leif and raises the boy into the hot-headed young lord we see in the games, bent on avenging his parents' deaths and uniting Thracia under him by conquering the peninsula's southern kingdom. I'm skimming over a lot here, but the long and short of it is that no matter how you choose to interpret Finn's feelings for Quan, there's no denying that Finn's long-lasting devotion comes to define the remainder of his life and even shape the political future of the Thracian peninsula. There is a teensy little complication that Quan has a wife and children, but given the way we see Quan doting on Finn by gifting him an incredibly powerful brave lance, which becomes Finn's personal weapon in FE5 by the way, I'd like to hope that Quan's been gifting him a certain other lance on the side, if you know what I mean. And hey, there's nothing saying that Ethlin can't know about that and be okay with it. Open marriages exist, and when you note that Quan married Sigurd's sister and his young protege physically resembles his good friend, you have to wonder if Ethlin wouldn't have put two and two together about her husband having some gay longing of his own left over from his school days. Arvis is the series' original Flame Emperor, but Quan may just be its original bisexual imperialist. Besides, say what you will about deep male friendships and such, but there's always been a homo-romantic undercurrent to concepts like military camaraderie and courtly love, and there's this strange but predictable double standard surrounding sex here, where it's treated as the ultimate expression of intimacy between a man and woman, and yet seen as diminishing allegedly platonic same-sex intimacy. Also, for what it's worth, Heroes actually leans into this interpretation, centering Finn's character around his devotion to Quan while deftly sidestepping all that business with the Lachesis shipping wars, because, yeah, those were a thing, and the question of who Nanna's biological father is. I've never really understood the appeal of Finn Lachesis when the two never speak in either Jugdral game, and all we know about Lachesis leaving Thracia behind is that Selphina claims that Finn was always cold toward women and more interested in her now husband Glade. But more seriously, keep a lookout for this type of homoromantic devotion motif between lords and their knights, because it's going to pop up several more times before we're through, including in the GBA games. The introduction of the C to A support system and paired endings went a long way toward transforming Fire Emblem from a series populated mostly by flat 1 or even 0-note units to the character-driven franchise that it largely is today. This, too, was the first era of official localization, kickstarting the Western FE fandom in the mid-2000s and introducing the franchise to a modestly sized new audience that nonetheless celebrated it for adding its characteristic eyebrow-raising content to the lineup of a Nintendo handheld. A few of the better-known instances of subtext from this era have stuck around in the collective consciousness of the fandom, and probably require little introduction, although credit for that must also be extended to Heroes in most cases. Lynn and Florina have a duo unit, Ephraim and Leon have a duo unit, Raven and Lucius don't have a duo unit, but they got a bound hero battle, so close enough. As it stands, the Ephion duo is to date the only male-male duo or harmonic unit in Heroes, so clearly someone on the staff has a soft spot for them. But let's take this back to the GBA games themselves. While it's not acknowledged all that much, the combination of the support system and Binding Blade functioning as a sort of soft reboot of FE1 meant that these games were responsible for codifying many of the now familiar series archetypes and establishing patterns of characterization that future games would often play with or reference. Take the Christmas Knights, for example. While there are, strictly speaking, multiple sets of primary colored-wearing paired knights in the Kaga games, each successive GBA game took that template and hammered it out into pairs of red and green cavaliers paired together with some kind of odd couple dynamic. Usually one is more serious, the other less so. These games could also be said to build off the very faintly sapphic undertones that accompany Pegasus Knights, as just as all male military organizations can produce all manner of furtive homoerotic content, the same is true when they're switched to all women. This one may be the explanation behind Florina and her crippling androphobia, with 6 of her 7 support options being with other women, as well as a well-known paired ending with her close friend Lynn. Some characters also return to the trope of knightly devotion, most prominently Percival in Binding Blade, who's so dedicated to a prince he thought dead that he's willing to throw his life away fighting for a rebellion until he discovers that Mildane is alive and masquerading as a bard, as you do. Aww. You could make a case for reading Joshua and Garrick's paired ending in Sacred Stones in a similar light, only theirs is less formal as these two are more mercenaries than royalty or knights. Also, I'm pretty sure Garrick's got a much bigger thing going on with both Tethys and Marissa after him, so I'm willing to put that one down to a pansexual polycule and call it a day. And of course, it's not all about slotting into archetypes. Raven and Lucius largely exist on their own, even if the alleged joke of Lucius's appearance would go on to be mined for more unfunny attempts at humor in the future. Eliwood and Hector mostly warrant a mention here owing to the way that Blazing Blade has to function as a prequel, because they're each established in Binding Blade as the fathers of playable characters, while Roy and Lelena's mothers are never mentioned. If I were to consider them as a serious romantic prospect, which I sometimes do, especially when Heroes toys around with the idea, I'd characterize Eliwood and Hector as a romantic friendship, a type of relationship brought up in discussions of queerness in the early modern era that consisted of two men or two women being physically but not sexually intimate, or at least not where anyone could see them, that is. I'm not sure what the closest modern equivalent to that would be. A queer platonic relationship, maybe? Regardless, I could easily see Eliwood and Hector having a relationship of that nature, with it having sexual dimensions perhaps only during adolescence and or after their wives have died or left them, or whatever happens to Roy and Lelena's mothers between games. Last, but certainly not least, we do need to talk about Ephion here. While I must point out that appreciation for this pairing is substantially higher today than it was back when Sacred Stones was current, there was even then acknowledgement that the emotional beats of Leon's development into the main villain hinge to a major degree upon which of Erica or Ephraim the player chooses at the root split, as from that point forward the game centers that twin during major plot events. On Erica's route, Leon's tale is a fairly straightforward one of unrequited love and demonic possession, but on Ephraim's route his character acquires some extra dimensions, building further on his feelings of inadequacy as a ruler and as a man capable of measuring up to his dear friend Ephraim. I'd say there's some classic triangulation of desire stuff going on regarding Leon's respective feelings toward the twins, with him projecting subliminal feelings of attraction toward Ephraim onto his explicit attraction to Erica in a manner that also incorporates FE8's notorious twincest subtext. Clearly the best solution for everyone here would be for them to become a bisexual, incestuous throuple, but that's not an option the story ever presents Leon with. Tragic, really, and ironic that, thanks to Heroes, Ephion is now more or less the most popular representation of gay content from these titles. Still, they can't hold a candle to the Tellius games. If you were to ask me to name the gayest Fire Emblem setting prior to Three Houses, it's Tellius, hands down. And in hindsight, that may be a bit of a surprise, considering these games stepped away a little from the features that produced such abundant subtext in their GBA predecessors. Radiant Dawn is infamous for removing proper support conversations, replacing them with generic bonds that can be formed between any two pairs of units, and both games are light on variable paired endings. And yet, there's so much to discuss here, much of it stemming oddly enough from the relationship between the two titles. Path of Radiance can best be described as a setup to Radiant Dawn's punchline, one that goes through the motions of a standard Fire Emblem plot so that its sequel can break down the myriad ways in which the fallout of such stories can be, in a way, even more tumultuous than what came before. That same sense of subversion permeates the character relationships with Tellius as well, with FE9 setting up a number of expected pairings according to series conventions, only to have FE10 come along and yank the rug out on those expectations, often in pointedly queer ways. There's no better example of this than Tellius' saga hero, Ike. The subject of Ike's sexuality has been a divisive one in the fandom for many years now, with his first game teasing a relationship with the Princess Valentia, although more so in localization, it must be noted, and his second giving him a choice of paired endings with either his caustic but deeply devoted tactician Soren, or the cunning and lightly mischievous catboy Mislagu's Ranulf. The details and legacy of Ike's sexuality wank are too extensive to get into here, but fortunately an old blogging friend of mine put together an absolute dissertation on the topic several years ago, even covering the infamous Priam of Awakening and the resurgence of wank his existence caused. I've linked that essay in the description, so check it out if you're interested. For my part, I acknowledge that Ike's relationship with Soren is the one more strongly grounded in canon, both within the Tellius games and on a meta level, since it calls back to some past Lord relationships like Sigurd Deirdre and Eliwood Ninian. But as a personal preference, I favor Ike's lighter buddy dynamic with Ranulf. It does surprise me a little to see modern fandom more or less accept that Ike is queer after so many long arguments on the subject, but here's to hoping that when or if we ever get Tellius remakes, they won't toss in anything new to incite a third round of discourse. I'm not sure I could handle that. Ike is far from the only instance of bait-and-switch queer subtext in these games, however. Christmas Night's Oscar and Kieran are as odd-coupley as ever, and Path of Radiance hands each of them a support line with a Pegasus Knight and looks to carry on a small recurring tradition dating all the way back to Archanea of pairing members of these two archetypes together. Yet, come Radiant Dawn, and it's Oscar and Kieran who are the ones who have an emotional reunion once their armies join up, whereas Oscar's former support partner Tanith appears to be quite close to her commander Sigrun, with the two of them at times acting much like parental figures toward their young Empress Sanaki. See what I said about the sapphic potential of Pegasus Knights? Elsewhere, Alencia sidesteps a potential romance with Ike to fall in love with her sworn knight Joffrey, but looking at the ending of Joffrey's sister Lucia, you have to wonder which of the siblings is really closer to the queen. In Path of Radiance, the young Heron Princess Leanne plays damsel in distress more than once, but it's her last rescuer and former babysitter Nasala who ends up with her in the sequel, while the Hawk King Tabarn is engaging in light BDSM with her brother Rayson. Funny that this isn't the first time we've seen a feminine-looking blonde paired with a rougher boyfriend who's sweet on him. Fire Emblem does love its recurring patterns. There's so many other little fragments scattered throughout these games, too, ranging from a king and his barely developed shadow, major villains taking a turn at that whole knightly devotion motif, minor villains doing the same thing, a close-to-literal bisexual catfight over Ranulf's affections, Ike as the father of Sot's children, Ilyana's bottomless appetite going to some unusual places, and of course Heather being Heather. As I alluded to in the intro, though, it's not all on the up and up. I have no idea what Valtome's deal is exactly, except that he's obsessed with Zelgius for some reason, and the less said about equal opportunity Heron molester Oliver, the better. All in all, you could easily put together at least one Pride Parade float with Tellius characters alone, spanning a wide range of interest and even accommodating furries, because, yeah, that is a small but significant part of this setting's lasting appeal. Ever notice how, despite the fact that you think that the Lagus would be an easy excuse for the developers to introduce a ton of catgirls and such, a much larger portion of them are beefy men in various states of undress? The gay fan base for these games definitely noticed. But I'm having too much fun here. It's time to face Awakening and Fates. The first two games in the era of what is currently called modern Fire Emblem represent a noticeable turning point in how the series handles queer content, likely as a result of gradually increased acceptance of that sort of material in media over the course of the last decade. Awakening, in particular, is notable for being the first FE game to explicitly acknowledge the concept of sexual orientation, unless you count this little moment regarding Heather and Radiant Dawn, that is. But by and large, that came coupled with a pretty substantial step back in terms of serious and meaningful subtext, both because now the idea of same-sex relationships was out in the open for everyone to see, and because Awakening resurrected Genealogy's breeding mechanics alongside S-rank supports and an avatar who can bed every recruitable character of the opposite gender. The meta surrounding FE's eugenics babies can be rather fascinating, but the need to write romantic supports for every possible combination of over a dozen men and a dozen women left little room for anything else, or even quality writing much of the time, as FE13 ushered in a surge of so-called gimmick character writing, in which minor characters are scripted entirely around a single personality trait that comes up in almost every interaction. The so-called avatar sexual characters, who can S-rank Robin and no one else, fare even worse. Their vastly limited support options place them more in line with characters from the GBA games or Path of Radiance, but the centralizing focus of avatar romance strips them of most, if not all, of their interesting character interactions they might have had. Awakening brought with it a tonal shift as well, aiming for lighter, softer, and more comedic both in its character writing and in its broader thematic elements. It's easy to read this as a symptom of FE13 being developed as potentially the last game in the series owing to the poor sales of earlier titles, and it's just as easy to see in this approach and in Awakening's runaway success the blueprint for the zany, gotcha-friendly adventures that would later define much of Fire Emblem Heroes. What relatively sparse queer subtext is there is by and large just as silly, ranging from drunken experimentation to the gayest and most incestuous rendition of the recurring Bara Bandit mini-bosses, to a goofy parody of knightly devotion, to some uncomfortable mistaken gender identity humor, to, that. I think perhaps most telling of all is that Awakening's most enduring gay legacy lies in its relationship between Chrom and male Robin, predicated, as I talked before, less on any actual subtext and more on the way the story script frequently doesn't account for Robin's gender. That's not a great sign, all things considered, and yet it seems to have been a message IS took to heart, because Fates made headlines for being the first ever game to include same-sex S-ranks for the avatar. It was only the second game to even have S-ranks, but who's counting? In what was either a funny coincidence or totally irrelevant and mildly offensive even to draw an association, depending on who you asked, only a few days after this news dropped, same-sex marriage became legal across the United States, which built even more hype for Fates in certain corners of the Western fandom, and in hindsight probably has something to do with how heavily fans built up expectations for same-sex S-ranks in Three Houses in the months prior to that game's release. Alas, Fates was doomed to disappoint on a multitude of fronts, queer content being only one of them, and while I'd be the first to assert that Awakening is the inferior of the two in practically every way, there's something to be said for the power of disappointment in shaping the legacy of a piece of media. Corrin indeed has two same-sex S-ranks, one male and one female, but each is locked to a different, individually sold version of Fates. Moreover, Niles is a casual pervert and definitely down for some kink, while Rajad is a stalker and essentially a clone of Tharia from Awakening who comes with issues of her own. And while I wouldn't consider myself a reliable first-hand source on Fate's localization discourse, I'm aware that in the original Japanese, Corrin supports with these two characters varied based on gender, with the same-sex versions actually verbalizing the queerness of the relationships. This was removed in localization. What's more, discomfort over the handling of the Avatar's S-ranks wasn't the only controversy of this nature Fates courted prior to its Western release. Even more damning was the case of Soleil, whose Japanese Corrin supports included lines that could be construed as suggestive of both date rape and conversion therapy, and which generated a lot of negative press and led to a fairly thorough overhaul of her character and localization. Is she queer, though? It's hard to say, really. As best I understand it, Japanese Soleil is written as a schoolgirl lesbian, a stereotype of a teenage girl who claims to be attracted to other girls, not as an authentic expression of her sexuality, but because she's emotionally immature and is just going through a phase, after which she'll grow up and learn how to be attracted to men like she's, supposed to. This is, to be fair, pretty offensive, even before compounding it with male Corrin more or less drugging her into being attracted to him. But at the same time, the changes to Soleil in localization have been bizarre to say the least. Localized Soleil is, or at least claims to be, an out-and-proud bisexual, confident in who she is and proudly accepted by her father, who shares her gimmick of being an incorrigible flirt with women. However, because localization couldn't or wouldn't add or remove supports, Soleil can still only S-rank men, although all of those conversations were changed to be platonic except for Corrin's, because Avatar privileges, and Forrest, because his gender nonconformity allows her to make an exception in his case, I guess. There's also the issue of her flirting with other female characters who are clearly not into her, most infamously with Ophelia. Yeah. A bit like the discourse over Ike's sexuality, in recent years fandom seems to have swept aside all the controversy surrounding Soleil and accepted her as a bi or lesbian icon. Heroes has definitely done its best to sand off her rougher edges, even if in doing so it's also avoided clarifying her sexuality, which is probably for the best, really. Now, you'd think that would be the extent of it, but unfortunately Fates' dodgy record on queer content doesn't end at pre-release clickbait articles. In FE14, eugenics babies are back by popular demand, except now they have nothing to do with the main plot and are microwaved until ready inside pocket dimensions, because that makes sense. Inevitably, this also means that Fates inherits all of Awakening's problems in that area, from a glut of shallow straight romances to awkwardly handled avatar sexuals to gimmick character writing, only now there's even more since the playable cast is about 1.5 times the size. It's unfortunate, too, because if you can overlook all that, and yes, I know that's a lot to overlook, Fates does show that it can handle serious and nuanced queer relationships when it wants to, and certainly to a greater degree than Awakening. Leo's relationship with Niles combines knightly devotion with sexually fluid thieves and the family trauma of the Norian royals into an intriguing codependent cocktail, while Leo and Takumi pick up the odd couple angle since Fates' Christmas knights are ninjas and also brothers this time. Camilla may be a wasp's nest of controversy all on her own, but there's a knowingly performative element to her sexuality that manifests both with her potential husbands and with her female retainers. Laszlo and Odin get emotionally honest about their double lives and even manage to talk seriously about Awakening's dumb Harvest Scramble DLC. Go figure. Shigure and Forrest have cute discussions about art and fashion that aren't afraid to get a little flirty near the end. I'm lightly amused by the existence of yaoi fangirl Nina, doubly so because of the irony that in order to recruit her, you can't pair her bisexual father with another man. She doesn't much resemble any of the women into gay male content that I've come across online, but she's inoffensive enough, not to mention incredibly meta as a concept. And of the characters who seem like they're bi for the Avatar but actually aren't, I find Azura to be the least bothersome. It helps that she and Corrin are the only characters in the game to have completely different support lines depending on the route you're playing, which allows for their relationship development to better line up with the ways their characters develop according to Corrin's choice at the start. It also helps that Corrin is the best avatar by far from a character perspective, but that's a whole other conversation. One of the consequences of Fire Emblem becoming more aware of its queer content is that you have to learn to take the bad with the good like this. That's something important to keep in mind for Shadows of Valentia. You might be thinking to yourself right now, is Fire Emblem Echoes really important enough to be the first game in the series to warrant its own entry? It was a flash-in-the-pan remake, and nobody remembers it unless they want to complain about bad map design. And to that I say, yes it does. I'd argue that in the realm of queer content, FE15 represents a certain level of maturation on the part of the series after the awkward growing pains of Awakening and Fates, presenting us with both an explicit and somewhat fleshed-out exploration of a character type taken from contemporary gay culture, and multiple instances of subtler subtextual writing like was the norm in Tellius and older games. There are, however, two big qualifications I need to interject here. One is that the two sides of Echo's queer writing are not connected at all, and can easily feel as though they came out of separate games entirely. The other is that this description applies only to the game's male characters. FE15 may be leaps and bounds ahead of the DS remakes in terms of presentation and expanded scope, but when it comes to misogynistic writing, it's still firmly of a piece with the Kaga games, and even surpasses the original Gaiden at times in this regard. You know that joke about how the ancient Greeks were such misogynistic bigots that they inadvertently wound up incredibly gay? That's Fire Emblem Echoes in a nutshell. To start with the most obvious talking point, Leon is openly, undeniably gay. Not just gay either, but openly in love with another male character and hopelessly devoted to him even though Valbar seems kind of oblivious about the whole thing. He's even afraid that Celica will think he's sleazy because he used to be into another guy who died in battle. Overreaction to the fan reception to Niles much? Leon also comes with a clear case of Peter Pan syndrome, lamenting over his twinkish looks fading and worrying that Valbar won't want him anymore as he enters the decrepitude of his mid-20s. I can't quite decide if anything about Leon is anachronistic exactly, but what I said before about him feeling like he doesn't fit in with the other queer content of Echoes definitely holds true. His and Valbar's support line ends just as Valbar finally figures out what's up, which, depending on your opinion, is either a cop-out or just leaving Valbar's reaction open to interpretation. Open to interpretation is also how I describe about 80% of the other men in this game. The centerpiece of FE15's subtextual offerings is without question the group of characters I humorously refer to as Clive's gay entourage. Clive himself is as heterosexual as they come, but for reasons unknown, the ranks of the Deliverance are filled predominantly with men who'd love to get into his blandly noble breeches, or each other's breeches for that matter. In the absence of true Christmas knights, Forsyth and Python carry on their typical dynamic, but that doesn't stop Forsyth's excited and weirdly erotic fanboying over both Lucas and Clive, and Python's snark at the same. Lucas clearly wants something out of Clive, although he has trouble verbalizing it, and his support line with Python delves into his apparent lack of interest in women, or possibly anyone at all. Python may be the only one of the three who doesn't get all starry-eyed in Clive's presence, but he's also this game's biggest source of vaguely dirty one-liners, and they're all directed at other men. Perhaps the most harmonious interpretation of these three that I've ever seen is that Lucas is asexual, Python is aromantic, and all three of them prefer men in their different ways and work out a long-distance friends-with-benefits arrangement post-game that manages to satisfy them all. Lucas gets the love and deep appreciation he could never get from Clive, Forsyth gets his manly military love, and Python gets pleasures of a nature that I'm not sure I can describe in detail on YouTube. But let us not forget the rejected member of the entourage. Fernand is Clive's childhood best friend, and in the same conversation where he exposes Claire as the brother-loving Lachesis archetype she's been rewritten as, she turns it around and insinuates that maybe Fernand wants to be more than friends there too. There's definitely some projection to be found in Fernand's contempt of Matilda, not to mention some jealousy over Lucas getting close to Clive that fixates on Lucas's tongue of all things. And despite the fact that we know Clive isn't interested in reciprocating or even capable of picking up on the subtext, his fallout with Fernand does read pretty easily as a bad breakup, even ending up with Fernand going on rebound. Berkut is likewise uninterested in that kind of martial devotion, and after he sacrifices his girlfriend for power, she promptly kills Fernand, which has to count as some kind of symbolism. Also, misogynistic, but that's Echoes for you. For the life of me, I can't understand what Clive's appeal is to all these men. I'm almost tempted to call it another parody in the vein of Crom and Frederick, but the associated support lines and story moments go to such emotionally sincere places at times that I can't come down on the writing too hard. That's not even the extent of it either, as FE15's unique morning quotes offer an opportunity for some darkly emotional moments, not just for Leon and the Deliverance Boys, but for villager BFFs Gray and Tobin as well. On a similar note, while the game lacks paired endings, it does adapt the original guidance practice of altering endings if another character died. Tobin's ending if Gray dies, and Forsyth and Python's endings if the other dies, are particularly devastating in terms of queer subtext, with Forsyth's even taking a turn toward grief-induced heteronormativity. Sucks to be Forsyth's wife in that scenario, but then at least she's not stuck forgiving her own murderer and welcoming him into heaven. Ugh. That's the thing about this game, though. It goes to some surprisingly thorough lengths to represent different facets of male homosocial camaraderie, from Leon the aging twink with his predilection for bears, to the closest this series has ever come to discussing asexuality, to open-minded flirt Jesse and his desire to build his own kingdom of men who like to show a little cleavage. But it does so largely at the expense of its female cast, who are frequently stuck feeling just as, if not more, secondary than they are in the Kaga games proper. Your mileage will definitely vary as to whether that's an acceptable trade-off. Okay, though. It's time for what I'm sure most of you have been waiting for. 3 Houses. Say what you will about how divisive this game's overall writing is, and people have said a lot, myself included. Its pick the parts you like and bash the rest to high hell approach suits its queer content perfectly, and it's helped greatly in this endeavor by carrying over Echo's presentation updates, like full voice acting and exploration sections, as well as by bringing back same-sex paired endings for non-Avatar characters for the first time since Ike's endings in Radiant Dawn. You can choose your preferred type of content, stick entirely to that, and still have plenty to enjoy, almost like choosing a house. What? Those labels are totally coincidental. Okay, mostly. You know what? I'll prove it. Let's talk about Ferdibert. Hubert and Ferdinand fascinate me on a number of levels, with each of them having layers to their subtext even before you get to their cute little tea dates. Hubert is unique among the Crimson Flower exclusive characters for being unable to S-rank both genders of Byleth, but I'd argue that he comes off as the most well-written bisexual of the three, precisely because his queerness doesn't revolve around identical scripts monologue to a silent player self-insert. His all-encompassing attraction to one woman defines much of his character and his role in the plot, so it's only natural that it factors into his romances with other women and into his unexpected wooing of his one male love interest. The guy may be a hideous, cold-blooded murderer who knows his way around chloroform and a straight razor, but his supports with Ferdinand take a surprising turn for the genteel, and their A-support has been compared to Mr. Darcy's first proposal scene in Pride and Prejudice of all things. Meanwhile, Ferdinand is a huge opera fanboy and opens up to hot mess diva Manuela about how he learned swordplay by imitating her dances on stage. Was he doing it in drag? We can only wonder, but it wouldn't be that far-fetched when you take into account just how consumed he initially is by wanting to surpass Edelgard in strength and political savvy and dancing. The switch to flustered Regency heroine feels pretty natural for him, actually, and even if that's not your cup of tea, it's not difficult to see in Ferdinand a mouthpiece for the moral dilemma of the Eagles' root split, since, Byleth's not exactly in a position to be a mouthpiece for anything. Either he takes the path of least resistance, ascends to the role of prime minister in the new empire to clear his family's name, and potentially invokes jealousy in his former rival by becoming the feigned lover of the most evil man in Fodlan, or he makes the hard choice to do the right thing, living on the run for 5 years and taking up arms against his own countrymen, including the man who might have been the only one who could have ever filled his huge hole. It's impulsive, emotional Crimson Flower versus rational, moral Silver Snow, and I can see the appeal of Ferdibert in either context, thank you very much. Okay then, you say, but what about the other characters? Well, remember Clive's gay entourage? What if this game had something like that too, only this time the Clive equivalent wants to be deeply intimate with all the men who love and admire him, and instead of an obvious girlfriend he spent 4 years prior to the start of the game bonded to another boy by deep-seated trauma, and he and his childhood best friend are clearly working on some issues, but they can actually resolve it during the game and reach a happy ending for them both. FE16 delivers beautifully on that score, giving what is easily the most well-rounded and multi-flavored rendition of the knightly devotion motif to date. Dimitri and Dedue are remarkably soft and tender with one another, considering their relationship was founded in the violence of genocide, and their support see them actually negotiating the power dynamic and coming to see one another as equals. And notably, it's Dimitri who wants to be closer and to elevate Dedue to his level right from the start, while Dedue is being the sensible one and considering the optics of the two of them being openly together, or friends, quote-unquote. But if there were more obviously queer-coded exchange in Fire Emblem history, I'm not sure I've come across it. Half their support line is about whether they should worry about what other people think of their relationship. I mean, come on. It's clear, too, from their ending that although they kept their relationship private, they didn't do a great job of it, because Dedue is posthumously rewarded with a burial worthy of a royal consort. Perhaps it was all those war orphans the two of them adopted. Talk about a fitting way to undermine Fargus's crest-based inheritance priorities and improve relations between Fargus and Duscur in the process. What's even better about Dimidue is that they're the gift that keeps on giving even outside Azure Moon. In Verdant Wind, Dedue's reaction to Dimitri's death calls back to the way Finn handles Quan's death in the Jugdral games, while in Crimson Flower the two of them have an alternative death scene if you're fast enough that gets so tragically homoromantic that the screen has to cut to black, lest no one ever be able to know homo their final moments. My only real gripe with this pairing is that Dedue is killed off by default in Azure Moon to ensure Dimitri's psychotic break during the time skip and also place his relationship with Byleth front and center, even though logically speaking this is really about centering the player. Indeed, 90% of Azure Moon's writing problems would be solved if only Byleth could have been booted out of the story. Dimitri alone among the House leaders already has an established emotional support network, and while Dedue is certainly central to that, I can't discount all the others who care for him. And in a move again reminiscent of the gay entourage, all of his closest supporters in the main story, except potentially female Byleth, are male. Gilbert and Rodrigue represent more paternal influences in Dimitri's life, but Felix struggles with complicated feelings toward his childhood friend for most of the game, ranging from bittersweet memories of their former closeness to disgust over Dimitri's violent episodes. He and Dimitri talk through these issues in their support line, and their relationship development even manifests in the story script of Azure Moon, reflecting their newfound understanding and Felix's maturity. And while most units benefit little, if at all, in terms of characterization from cross-house recruitment, Felix outside Azure Moon undergoes some pretty severe negative character development, showing off just how much a part of his life Dimitri still is, even after Felix has rejected him. In a single act of teenage rebellion against his father and former best friend, Felix transforms into the Navarre archetype at its worst, becoming the same kind of ruthless killer he'd written off Dimitri as. His endings outside Azure Moon are noticeably less satisfying as a reflection of this, further underlining what Felix has lost in Dimitri. That even holds true for his relationship with Sylvain, easily the fandom juggernaut of male-male pairings for this game, and one with a lot of appeal thanks to their bickering dynamic and high potential for angst regardless of route, although as mentioned, their ending too gets grimmer outside Azure Moon. Either way, it ends with at least one of them dying, though. Fargus truly is the land of homoerotic death packs. Of course, the intimately homosocial vibes of Azure Moon encourage me to remark that Dimitri does indeed have two hands, and that each of his lovers also has two hands, and so forth and so on. One can only hope that the royal bed is big enough to accommodate. On the topic of what Dedue's other hand is doing, Dedue and Ash bond over food and the pain of loss. Ash and Caspar bicker over ethics and adopt a cat. Caspar and Linhart physically resemble Ike and Soren, but their support line is remarkably devoid of meaningful chemistry, and I'd write them off completely except that they travel the world in their ending in imitation of their apparent inspiration. Oh well, they can't all be winners. Ditto Raphael and Ignatz, who go to some potentially spicy places but get no homoed by their ending. Yuri and Balthus of the Ashen Wolves wind up a crime boss and his bodyguard, and when Yuri is bi for Byleth and Balthus has a curious fixation with wrestling Dimitri, that may be more promising than it sounds. Oh, and speaking of Abyss, there's a strange, lightly absurd tale of the Abyss Keeper and the knight he dubs Mr. Backup. I'd much rather these two made it into heroes than Gatekeeper, honestly. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the women, too, because unlike Shadows of Valentia, Three Houses offers a plethora of lesbian subtext to choose from. There's a commoner falling in love with a princess, two stars of the stage finding love and comfort with one another, an outgoing and shy duo who just recently got to go to the beach together, good school friends turned late-in-life lesbians, and what would happen if the schoolgirl hot for teacher fantasy was hot for a cougar. The strongest material of all by far involves Catherine, whose explicit love for two other women is woven into the game's main story. She's devoted to Rhea without question, and even when they can't support, Catherine still manages to have a paired ending with Rhea in some routes, in what is easily the series' first substantial instance of knightly devotion between two women. At the same time, though, Catherine's relationship with Shamir is equally significant, with their supports working out their differences and concluding on one of the most explicit acknowledgments of a non-Byleth queer relationship in the entire game. Similar to what Silver Snow does to Ferdibert, Crimson Flower spins Cathmere in a tragic direction, forcing Catherine into a situation where she has to choose her lady love over her partner. I would say on the other routes where Rhea lives that Catherine has two hands, but as I said, lesbian content is not my specialty, and as such I must leave the details of that up to others. Well, I've avoided it long enough, but now I suppose for completion's sake I need to address the silent elephant in the room. As you may have picked up on by now, I don't care for avatars, and despite the fact that Byleth is the least customizable avatar yet, they're also the one most clearly scripted as a self-insert, since they have no voice of their own, which leaves them unable to ever develop as a character without the player projecting a voice and personality onto them. This is why I place so little value on the avatar's S ranks, even the same-sex ones, of which there are 10 this time, and yes, I know 2 of them are platonic, it's not really relevant to this discussion. Byleth supports are more like monologues, with occasional player prompts that affect usually no more than the next line, and for the same-sex options the scripts are the same regardless of gender. This creates a certain artificiality to these scenes, making queerness out to be less of an aspect of one's identity and personal expression and more of a toggle in a menu, which it actually is in the support log, how about that? We know that Fodlan has its share of faux medieval patriarchal values and gender-based social pressures, so it's terribly superficial for the game to act as though this wouldn't factor into Byleth's queer relationships. That, for example, Linhart, who intends to procreate with Flayn specifically to study the effects of crest incest on their children, wouldn't value a relationship with female Byleth more highly for a similar reason. Or that Dorothea, who has years of experience plying her trade with men, I can relate, wouldn't approach the matter of securing her future with female Byleth differently than she would the male version. The lack of gender differentiation leads to other issues as well. The relationship between Byleth and Edelgard is meant to be the emotional core of Three Houses, but I can't find it in me to celebrate it as some great watershed in storytelling when it's a safe guess based on their interactions and on the assumed target demographic of these games that Edeleth was scripted with male Byleth in mind, with Edelgard being able to get with the female version more in order to allow for the writers to include romantic moments between the two in the main story without needing to alter the script. Working with, rather than against, the sort of accidental queerness connected with Awakening and Fates as avatars, in other words. In that sense, I'm actually happy that Dimitri can't S-rank male Byleth, as there's no easier way to notice just how artificial Byleth's presence is in the narrative of Azure Moon than by playing as the male version, witnessing a bunch of intimate moments between him and Dimitri that come at the expense of Dimitri's relationships with characters who've known and loved him for years, and then get to the end and not get a payoff to that build-up, because only female Byleth can have one of those. Without Byleth, Azure Moon's narrative is a subtly queer one, because Dimitri's character development comes from him rejecting violent revenge and learning to open up about his grief and trauma so that he can work through them in healthier ways, not try to repress it like he does for most of Part 1. It stresses emotional honesty, community, civic duty, and understanding the feelings of the less fortunate in the face of betrayal, war, and death, and can be read as advancing this through male love and camaraderie in opposition to Edelgard's military aggression, emotional reserve, and egomaniacal belief that only she knows what's best for all of Fodlan. Traits borrowed from a worldview steeped in the toxic masculinity not all that different from Dimitri at his lowest. That's a hell of a lot more compelling than imagining this route as a light dating sim fantasy where you, the player, get to fix a bad boy. And as for Claude, I said I wouldn't bring him up, but even just touching on him, the guy's got nothing in terms of subtext unless you want to read liberally into some of his behavior toward Byleth, which, again, gender variable self-insert. He's about as canonically bisexual as Crom is, and for the same flimsy avatar-centered reason. Edelgard is fixated on Byleth no matter what, and Dimitri's character arc hinges around emotional openness, but Claude remains closed off to everyone as part of his broader goals. It's often forgotten about by the fandom, but the revelation that Claude is an Almyran prince doesn't come up anywhere in-game until his ending cards, with the most he's willing to reveal to Byleth being only that he was born outside of Fodlan. It's difficult to mark any notable subtext for a character who's never very forthcoming about himself, which is why pretty much all the queer Claude content you'll see is fanon, with fans coming along and granting him the interiority that the game itself conceals. Like I said way back at the start of this video, I don't have a problem with fanon, it's just not for me most of the time. The same is true if you like Byleth or their ships, and we can agree to disagree on that. If I had to characterize FE16's queer content as a whole, I'd say it takes a buffet-style approach to just about everything relating to its characters and story, where you can take what you like, fill in the game's abundant empty spaces where you will, and ignore the rest. Practically from the beginning, Fire Emblem has been at least partially about catering to a wide range of sexual interests, some less conventional or socially accepted than others, so it makes sense that for the first mainline console release in over a decade, the developers would cast as wide a net as possible, ensuring that fan work and petty internet arguments will keep this game alive and current in our collective consciousness for however many years it takes them to run out of ideas for Three Houses alts and heroes. Whew. Wow. I think calling this an abridged history was somewhat inaccurate. I didn't even touch on content specific to spin-offs like Heroes and Warriors, because I figured the 16 mainline games would be more than enough. But semantic issues aside, I do have one last point or two to make before I wrap up. Given my generally cynical conclusions on why most, if not all, of Fire Emblem's queer subtext exists, it may surprise you to learn that I had a point here beyond, here's a bunch of gay stuff, go ship it. While that in itself may be a solid enough purpose, especially if it helps familiarize anyone with the utility of these kinds of readings and some basic tenets of academic queer theory I've sprinkled in here and there, I do think there's another motivating factor here. It's my hope that those who've watched this, thinking that Avatar S-Ranks were the be-all end-all of queer content in Fire Emblem, are now more aware of a much bigger picture. One dating back to a time when reading into bits of subtext might have been the easiest way to find characters in fictional media whose lives and identities best matched your own. I wouldn't say subtextual writing is a lost art, in Fire Emblem or in general, and in case you couldn't tell from my discussion on Three Houses, I definitely feel like it still has a place when explicit queer content is so lackluster and, dare I say it, half-assed. It's definitely worth appreciating at the very least, and using it as inspiration for fan work as well. But that's, finally, all for this piece of fan work. I'd like to thank you all so much for listening and watching. This was my first ever project with any video content, so while I know it's rough around the edges, I really enjoy getting to put this together and share my love of Fire Emblem and my love of queer subtext with everyone. Thank you especially to my patrons, and to all the bloggers and other fandom friends whose observations and analyses over the years helped contribute to all of this. Now I'll close by turning this around to you guys. What's your favorite piece of queer subtext in Fire Emblem? Did I leave any out you want to talk about? How do you feel about FE's queer content overall? Do you think any of it qualifies as serious queer representation? Let me know in the comments, and a happy Pride to everyone. Au revoir.